over $31 trillion. This is the current US debt. Those are a lot of zeros. Yet, even this number doesn't seem to be enough because the US is running out of cash.
We will run out of cash, and there is a chance it could be as early as June 1st.
If the US runs out of cash, the Treasury won't be able to pay its bills, and this will lead to a default, which means no Social Security payments, higher borrowing costs, and millions of jobs lost. Okay, this sounds harsh, but how did we even get to this point? And what would a default mean for you? First of all, what does this run out of cash concept means for the country? So the US has its budget. Essentially, any country's budget consists of its revenue and spending. The revenue comes from the taxes collected, and the spending includes everything from paying the government wages to financing education and national parks. And then, based on the ratio of revenue and spending, the country either gets a surplus, meaning more revenue than spending, or a deficit, which occurs when the government spends more than it collects. The third option is to have a balanced budget, and that happens when the spending and the revenue are equal. The last surplus for the federal government was in 2001. That means the US has had deficits over 20 years. For instance, in 2022, the government collected $4.9 trillion in revenue and spent around $6.27 trillion. As a result, we run a deficit of $1.38 trillion. Yet that number is not the highest one in history. In 2020, the US government reached a record budget deficit of $3.1 trillion. On the other hand, in 2000, we had a budget surplus of $24 billion. When Congress and the president approved more budget spending than revenue, this adds to the deficit. So how does the government cover all of it then? Well, by taking on debt. The debt is basically all the deficit accumulated throughout the years plus the interest rates. And the American debt grows year after year. The department in charge of all this money flows is the US Treasury, and the debt is created by selling bonds. Those can also be bills or notes, but to simplify things, let's just call them bonds. So how does that work? Well, let's say the Treasury sells a $1,000 bond for a term of 20 years. The buyer gets a locked-in interest rate. If it's 3%, for example, then they get $30 every year. And after 20 years, they can cash out the bond and get their $1,000 back. In this case, individuals, banks, and businesses get their return on their investments, and the government has money to pay its bill. But there's one issue there. The Treasury can't issue an unlimited number of bonds because the US has something called a debt ceiling. The debt ceiling is rather a rare thing worldwide. While all the countries have debt, only the US and Denmark have debt ceilings. In the case of Denmark, this limit is so high that they don't seem to reach it anytime soon. This is not the case for the US, where the government must constantly raise the debt ceiling. It appeared in 1917 and was supposed to be a routine thing, but in reality is far from that. Both Democrats and Republicans use this opportunity as leverage when their party doesn't control the White House. This time, it's the same. Republicans see the debt ceiling as a great benefit to demand budget cuts. Since 1960, the US debt ceiling has been raised 78 times. 49 times when a Republican was the president, and 29 when Democrats were in charge of the White House. Under President Ronald Reagan, the debt limit was raised 18 times. Under President George W. Bush, 7 times, and 3 times when Donald Trump was the president. Under the previous administration, the national debt increased by around $8 trillion, and Democrats assure that it was done with no strings attached. And that's exactly what they're asking for now. Yet, Republicans have their own view.
A no strings attached debt limit increase will not pass.
But political experts say that the debt ceiling crisis we see right now doesn't have much reasoning behind it.
It's more of a political issue now than an economic one.
We could feel it even more by reading the headlines. Just check these out. Playing Russian roulette with debt ceiling. America's debt is a ticking time bomb, playing with fire in the debt ceiling standoff, playing political games with the debt ceiling, play chicken with the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling as a staring contest. You see, for decades, both parties engage in legislative battles over the debt limit, using it to speculate on the financial irresponsibility of another party. The speculation usually lasts until the point where markets begin to panic. This time, Republicans control the House of Representatives, but they hold it by a very slim majority. The latest voting share is 51% for Republicans and 49% for Democrats. We see an almost equal share of votes in the Senate as well, only there the Democrats are in charge with the exact opposite ratio, 49% for Republicans and 51% for Democrats. And everyone understands that they need a bipartisan agreement, so both parties will have to compromise. So what does the Republican Party fight for?
Curve our spending, raise our debt limit, and also grow our economy.
That sounds reasonable, but what is the issue then? Well, some political experts doubt the nature of demands from the Republican Party.
And they're holding a gun to the government's head, and there is absolutely nothing substantive.
Besides, in response to the Republicans' Limit Safe Growth Act, a group of U.S. Senate Democrats wrote a letter to the president. There, they specify potential consequences if they brought the Republican Act to life. Some of the impacts could include almost 800,000 Americans will lose their jobs. The economy will get closer to a recession, and several groups of Americans will lose access to medical care, nutrition, rentals, and other basic needs. On the other hand, the Republicans say that the American debt is way too high, and according to the House Speaker McCarthy, over the next 10 years, the US will pay $10.5 trillion in interest for the debt. And if we put things into perspective, from 1940 until today, the American government paid $9 trillion. So basically, for the last 83 years, the US spent less on interest than it will be in the next 10 years. But it also makes sense. Let's look again at the budget deficit data over the years. We can see that until the 2008 crisis, the American government either had a balanced budget, a surplus, or a deficit barely reaching $400 billion. Yet, does the US have too much debt? Well, the truth is that it is hard to say. If we compare the national debt to GDP, there is a whole batch of countries in front of the US, and some of them are developed economies that are far from recessions and other economic turmoil. But now the American debt is 120%. This means that it is 20% larger than the US GDP, which is basically the whole economy. Even though experts aren't unanimous on whether debt is good, everyone is sure that unnecessary debt is bad. So just like that, the debate on the debt ceiling goes on. And this isn't the first time the US faces a political crisis like this. The most notable ones were in 1995, 2011, 2013, and 2021. Back in 2011, President Obama was responsible for finding some common ground and raising the debt ceiling. The political games got really concerning at some point, and the government started fearing that it will lose its investors' global credibility.
If we don't come to an agreement, we could lose our country's AAA credit rating.
And the president's concern partially came true. Even though Congress raised the US debt limit at the last minute, the American credit rating was downgraded for the first time in US history. That time, one of the big three credit rating firms withdrew the AAA rating from the US. That change didn't have much of an effect, but it did prove that even political fights and the wondering of whether they will or they won't could make the US a less desirable place to invest. And for those wondering, a credit rating assesses the level of risk associated with countries worldwide. Ratings consider a variety of economic factors, and they're regularly adjusted to give investors a clear image on how safe a country is. That's why Canada and Germany have a AAA score, while Puerto Rico and Lebanon have a D. And as with any credit score, the higher the risk, the more expensive the borrowing is. And as the US is also the issuing country of the global currency, the dollar, the stability of the American financial and political system is a must.
A lot of the global financial system depends on treating U.S. Treasuries as basically without risk.
The media is already speculating on whether we should wait for a global chaos associated with all the debt ceiling talk in the US right now. Everyone understands the influence of the American economy going far beyond its borders.
So it would be disastrous if we didn't raise the debt ceiling.
So what would exactly happen if the US government fails to raise the debt ceiling? The Treasury will run out of cash and have no money to pay its bill. This will lead to a default. And by definition, a default is a failure to meet legal obligations. And according to the recent poll by The Economist and YouGov, Americans don't think that default is too bad. In fact, only 1/3 of the population believes that if the US defaults on its debt, it will lead to a crisis. But it isn't quite like that. If the US breaches its debt ceiling and it leads to a prolonged default, the consequences could get really serious. The American economy will fall into recession. Financial markets will fall. Retirement accounts will be devastated. The borrowing costs will increase for the country as a whole, as well for businesses and individuals. And according to Moody's estimation, nearly 8 million Americans will lose their job. The people who work for the government won't get paid, and there will be no Social Security payments. And the list could go on. Yet, one of the most dramatic reasons of default will probably be the damage to the US international reputation as a trustworthy market. This factor could potentially lead to replacing the US as the world's first economy, which will change every American's life. So far, the US has never defaulted on its debt, and the good news is that the government assures that this time is no exception.
Default is not an option.
So what is the best way to not default? Easy. Find a compromise and raise the debt limit. As simple as that. In reality, the parties find it hard to agree on something. The Republicans demand several budget cuts, while the president says that should be discussed when the default is off the table.
We have to come to common ground. That's the only way this has ever gotten done.
But what if they don't reach a compromise? Are there other ways the government could raise the debt limit and avoid default? Yes, and even more than one. But all of them have downsides. One of the options is a process called a budget reconciliation. Created in 1974, a budget reconciliation can accelerate some changes to the legislation. Under the budget reconciliation process, lawmakers can change spending, revenue, or the debt ceiling. But in this case, it will be impossible to apply it because it is complex and very time-consuming. And the clock is ticking. The next alternative is even trickier. The president can use the 14th Amendment of the Constitution to bypass Congress and increase the debt ceiling. This section states that the validity of the public debt of the United States should not be questioned. Yet, there are some serious issues with this option. President Biden said that it will almost certainly spark a legal battle, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has also downplayed the possibility, saying any attempt to invoke it will spark a constitutional crisis. But when Treasury Secretary was asked if this alternative was still on the table, she didn't deny it.
What to do if Congress fails to meet its responsibility? There are simply no good options.
Although not a good option, there is a third and extravagant alternative. Quoting Vox journalist Dylan Matthews in this article on the debt ceiling, he says, "No option will be funnier," in a way that matches the absurdity of the situation Washington finds itself in than this one. Minting a platinum coin worth $1 trillion to pay for the government expenses. If you aren't familiar with this idea, you might be very surprised. But this isn't some kind of fantasy. It is a real deal. Look, here's the New York Times looking for an answer to whether a coin could save the day. Here is Business Insider saying that a coin could save the US from economic catastrophe. And there is Bloomberg saying that a coin might not be as absurd as it sounds. Well, The idea was first discussed during a similar crisis in 2011. So normally, the Fed decides when and how much money Treasury can print. But there is a law that allows the Treasury Secretary to mint and issue platinum coins in whatever denomination and quantity. And what do they do after mining it? They deposit it at the Fed. By the way, did you know that the Treasury actually has an account at the Federal Reserve? And if we go to the Federal Reserve's financial statements, we can even see how much the US Treasury has deposited in that account. So basically, the Treasury could mint his $1 trillion platinum coin, put it in its account at the Fed, and have an extra $1 trillion to pay its obligation. But the most concerning thing about this coin alternative is how it could be perceived globally, because now the US Treasury has an impeccable reputation.
The US Treasury is seen as the safest and soundest borrower on planet Earth.
But it could change. And the truth is that while we're discussing these scenarios, the X day is getting closer and closer. And the closer we get to June 1st, the more panic we'll see.
The closer you get, you have markets get volatile, maybe the stock market go down, the Treasury markets will have their own problems.
The good thing is that no one is really interested in default because the members of the Congress also know that it can do no good to their well-being and the whole country's future. But for now, they still have a few meetings ahead to compromise on.
And the staff's going to continue meeting daily to make sure we do not default.
So what do you think will be the final result? Let me know down in the comment section. And if you found value in this episode, share it with families and friends. See you in the next video. Bye-bye.